Is there a difference in men and women's leadership behavior? No. Is there a difference in how we interpret men and women's leadership behavior? Absolutely. And if you can't articulate for yourself why you think it's important to be inclusive, and if you are male or female, it doesn't matter. The people on your team can feel that you don't see, this as important. So being able to articulate it for yourself and share it out with others, I think is going to help you with your leadership.
Welcome to The Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Today, I'm looking forward to a great conversation with Dr. Stephanie Johnson about gender-related variations in leadership. Dr. Johnson is a graduate of Claremont McKenna College and holds a PhD in Industrial and Organizational Psychology from Rice University. She's an associate professor and the academic director of the Center for Leadership at the University of Colorado, Boulder. She's published numerous scientific papers and is the author of the Wall Street Journal national bestseller, Inclusify, The Power of Uniqueness and Belonging to Build Innovative Teams. Dr. Johnson, thank you for joining me today on The Science of Leadership.
Hey, Tom, thanks for having me.
All right, well, we're going to be talking about gender-related variation in leadership, and this could be seen as potentially divisive for some folks, but I don't think it has to be. Though I have read quite a bit in the scientific literature on the topic, I'm hoping to approach our conversation really kind of from an agnostic and curious outlook. So let me ask you, based on your scientific work, what are the differences, or are there differences, in how men and women lead?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, really the ultimate authority on this is a woman called Alice Eagly. She's done the major meta-analytic work, which a meta-analysis is a study of all the studies ever done. So, you found in your readings, Tom, that one study will show, yes, there's a difference. One study shows, no, there's a difference. One study shows the difference is the opposite of what the first study showed. And so what a meta-analysis does is looks at all of the studies, puts them together and looks at, is there an overall positive, negative effect? And then also, can you explain across studies why some might have found X while the other found Y, right? So is there a difference? I would say the research thus far would say there's really very little difference. That if you look at the distribution of the population of men, and I'll say in the United States, right? There might be cultural variations, and I don't know if if the meta-analysis always take that into account, but in Western countries, the distribution of how men lead, are they more directive, and how directive are women? They're practically overlapping distributions, saying they are quite similar. I think Alice Eagly's meta-analysis showed women use a little bit more transformational, visionary, charismatic types of leadership than men. But if you look at the distribution, they're widely overlapping. So
right.
I really would say for me, there's not big, meaningful differences in how men and women lead. What was your interpretation?
Yeah, I think when I look at the data and Dr. Eagly's work and then other studies that have been done on this, I kind of come to the same conclusion. And the thing that is perhaps we can explore this a bit is, though the data show that, I think, pretty well. And as you say, what we call the magnitude of effect, if we just look at a single study, the magnitude of effect is very small. If there is a difference, it's statistical, but it actually practically doesn't matter to what you're saying. But then, and you and I are both academicians, and so maybe we're affected more by the academic domain and these sorts of mindsets than perhaps some in our society. But it sure seems like people want there to be a difference,
Yeah.
And Why is that?
And there are huge differences in our beliefs about men and women's leadership. So you're right. We believe there's a big difference. And to the extent that we tend to see what we believe or we get what we expect,
Yeah.
there we see big differences, even if they're not there. And so, like, how do you know they're not there, right? Well, just this isn't a leadership study, but the similar studies have been done on leadership. But I just came across this study recently looking at views of professors teaching classes. And so they're online classes, maybe it's the time of COVID, we have these online classes, and they had the same person teach two sections. Maybe you've seen these too. You're nodding and laughing. Two sections of the same class. And then they lie to people and they tell them that one of the professors is a woman and one of the professors is a man. And the professor, let's just say it's a double blind study. I don't know what the students think if I'm a man or a woman. So I'm not, behaving differently because I'm trying to confirm the expectations of the study. And people will interpret the very same, it's the same person. They interpret their professoring different if they believe it's a man or a woman. Yeah. So I guess if you ask the question, is there a difference in men and women's leadership behavior? No. Is there a difference in how we interpret men and women's leadership behavior? Absolutely. And which of those things matters more?
Wow, that's a great question. Let's explore that, but I want to come back because I want to come back to the Pygmalion effect, which is kind of what we're talking about, and I want to explain that shortly for the listeners. But yeah, from your perspective, which does matter more?
Well, so maybe to whom? I think probably the perceptions matter more. If a student doesn't learn anything in my class because they, think I don't know what I'm talking about, that outcome does matter, right or wrong, right? So that's what the study on professors found is people have more negative reactions to women professors than they do men professors, even though it's the same professor. And the same thing with leadership. If I'm leading a team and people think, because I am, a more direct person, not more direct than maybe a man, but I am a direct person who happens to also be a woman. If people think I don't like them because I'm direct, that does matter. Like, I don't think it's right. Their interpretation might be, like you could say, biased. People don't like them, but they might be biased, but they still feel like I don't like them. And that's a problem. It's a problem for me as a leader. And it's a problem for them as a direct report or a team member who might want to go work for someone else who they feel like they have a better relationship with.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree with you that ultimately it's about, if we're trying to be effective leading people and for whatever reason, their cognitive biases, expectations, perspectives, what have you, lead them to respond less positively to our influence and our leadership, then we aren't going to be able to lead them as well, and that is going to be problematic and probably frustrating to some degree as a leader. Coming back to the Pygmalion effect, so for our listeners, it's this idea that people behave as we expect them to behave, and we get the responses that we expect from people. People will live up to or down to the expectations that are placed on them. And there was this interesting study from the education domain back in, what was it, the 60s, 50s, 60s, Rosenthal.
In the classroom.
Yeah. And so basically what they did was they took these classes at a given school, and they said, okay, here, they told a teacher, we're giving you these kids who are brilliant. They're all gifted, okay? And then they told the other set of teachers, we're giving you the dregs. These kids are terrible. They're no good. But the reality was, across all the classrooms, the kids were equal on all of their assessments, on all their scores. They were equal. Nobody was a better performer than anybody else. They were all the same. It was only the teacher's expectation that that particular teacher was getting a group of geniuses, or that particular teacher was getting a group of clowns. And at the end of the year, they did the assessments again. And it turned out the teachers who thought they had geniuses when the assessments came out. And the teachers who thought they had clowns, well, they didn't score as well. So, and that's been shown in so many different studies, this kind of thing. And I think that plays a key role in this conversation.
Right. And importantly to that study, it wasn't that the teacher thought they were geniuses. It was on standardized test scores. They actually scored, the geniuses scored more highly. So it's huge. And, we see this in the leadership domain as well. Daviden's work took it to military contexts, and they did the same thing. These studies would never be approved today, by the way. You can't go tell little kids teachers that these kids are remedial when they're not. But at the time, different standards, right?
Right.
But we see it in our workplaces. And, I love what you do here about talking about the science of leadership, because if there's one thing that leaders need to know, whether they're male or female or non-binary, is that if they have low expectations for their direct reports, they will certainly confirm your expectations, because and what Daviden's work shown, some of it self-efficacy. People pick up on the confidence that you have in them, and they feel more confident, and then they actually do better. But then it's also how much time you spend with them. If you think they can really perform because they're geniuses, and like the classroom study, they don't perform well, you're like, why don't you stay in at recess? Because I know that you can get this, right? All we need to do is just spend like 5 minutes together. And we see the same thing in the workplace with leaders. Like, this assignment seems I don't want you to fail. I'm just looking out for you. I'm protecting you. Yeah. I'm not going to give it to you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's extraordinarily valuable. And it gets to, wow, this is at the crux of great leadership that so many people, I think, that are out there have no idea about. Yeah. What you expect of your people it's very rare that they will exceed your expectation.
Yeah.
So turning to the kind of work that you do from scientifically and your writing and things, what are you finding?
So I'll cite there's meta-analysis, but, and so this again isn't my research, but the question of, do men and women's leadership styles differ? Like, not that much. Is one more effective than the other? It's like probably, similar answer, very overlapping distributions, but sort of more contemporary recent data show a competitive advantage, a, gender advantage for female leaders over male leaders. They're doing a better job. I don't know. They're performing. I'm going to say, I'm still going to answer their overlapping distributions.
Right. Sure.
But this is in my textbook that I use in my leadership class. And some people in my class found this incredibly sexist to point out. And so, one of the things that I'm finding, and, you could say in my research, but also just in my experience, is that this topic is really contentious. And there's a lot of backlash against an effort to create more gender equity, if it's on boards or in leadership roles. There's a lot of people who find this like really offensive or threatening. I don't know if are you feeling the same thing in your experience?
I think that you're hitting on something that this goes so much further than just our conversation on leadership, right? This is a societal issue, I think, at this time. And I would say that, yes, I think I can definitely see different groups of people who feel threatened. And so as somebody who's trying to, again, be agnostic, I'm trying to figure out where's reality.
Yeah.
Where's the reality versus whether somebody is promoting a certain thing or demoting a certain thing or whatever it may be. Where is reality? And as you were talking, the question I was thinking about is it a contemporaneous effect with regard to women's leadership? Some of the stereotypical female leadership approaches being more efficacious. Could that be a contemporaneous effect in that our society and the expectations in our society have been changing? We have become far and away the most egalitarian society, I think. Maybe there's been another one, but I don't know. Like, we're extraordinarily egalitarian, yet in the face of that, we see these issues with disparities and things. And so is it perhaps, as we've moved into a place of egalitarianism, maybe less absolute physical threat? I don't know.
That's a good, I'll tell you, my hypothesis is actually, because since some people in my class felt very offended, we went and looked at the study that was cited in the textbook. And my interpretation of the result is that the percentage of women entering the workforce who end up in leadership roles is much smaller. So even though we don't see big differences in women's and men's leadership behavior, we do see big differences in who gets promoted. And even if you control for performance, this is going to make people mad, but I can't argue. This is like pretty well established. All the meta-analyses show the same thing. There's men get promoted more quickly into leadership roles, controlling for their performance. And you can say, why? Why would that be? Because our expectations, think leader, think male. We still associate leadership with masculinity, with dominance, with command presence, right? So we have a larger percentage of men in the workplace find themselves in leadership roles than women. So maybe you could say the access is more strict for women. Only really the best of the best women are getting through the pipeline and finding success. And there's fewer of them. The distribution is going to be tighter. Like, these are pretty darn good women leaders who make it through. And the distribution's wider for men because more make it through. And so you're comparing the very best of the best. Let's say 20% of women make it into leadership roles and 50% of men. The women are better, but they're the best 20% of the women who made it through. So that was kind of my interpretation. Not that there's an inherent difference, but just that.
Yeah, it's a selection bias almost.
It's a selection bias.
Yeah. I really appreciate that perspective, because that fits with, I think that fits very well with the data that we have. The fact that if you look in most studies, there isn't significant demonstrable difference, but as we move along, as you say, the filter for women is narrower, and so that the people who get through are just better.
They're not better than men, but better than the women who didn't make it through. So now
exactly. They're as you say, they're the upper 20%, whereas maybe the men that are getting through are the upper 50% of men. And that's just the bell-shaped curve. If you're taking aptitude, then that average of the 20% is going to be higher.
Yeah. And then that said, I think leadership is not about aptitude, right? We know the genetic component of leadership is, what is it, 30%? What meta-analysis would say,
right?
Rich Harvey's data. So there's also, even, if people make it through or not, like, what are they investing in their leadership? Are they continuously learning and engaging in development, listening to podcasts like this one, reading books, going back, working on honing their skills? Then that would kind of negate differences that people brought into the leadership role. So I think there's, maybe there's, all hope is not lost, right? I just don't like any implication that leadership is, you have it or you don't. Like, you can still, we can all learn it. Hopefully we all are every day.
Yeah. And this is something that I've told my son time and again, it doesn't matter what you're born with. It's what you do with it that counts.
Yeah.
And so I think leadership absolutely is that. Are there some people, if we do look at those studies, the 30% is genetically mediated. that just means those folks are a little bit ahead of the curve, but doesn't mean that they can't be caught. And it doesn't mean that they're actually going to apply that capability in some way that actually is meaningful.
Yeah.
You said something that you were talking about various things, masculine traits
Dominance,
and
command,
attributes.
presence.
Yeah. So the command presence, this is something actually that I've been, that I was discussing with a mentee just recently. And after discussing it, I started thinking about it more, was the timbre of someone's voice. There are certain vocal characteristics that we do not attribute with strength and leadership and so forth. And I think there are probably anthropologic reasons for that, right? The person who can scream the loudest, most effectively, that carries the farthest, because low frequencies carry farther, can be heard on a battlefield,
Mm-hmm.
can scare away a lion, can do whatever it may be. Like maybe that has a reason. That's a part of, I'm just freewheeling here, but maybe that's a part of the reason that some of those things are, that we attribute leadership to that, because sometime in human history, those were actually requisite on some level, whereas now that isn't necessarily the case, but it takes a long time to change biology.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I do think there's changes though. So another Alice Siegley study used sort of national survey data like over time. And to something you said earlier, people's expectations are changing in the workplace. I mean, just think of our millennials and Gen Zs and their expectation for flexible work, and that the workplace is going to promote and support work-life balance and well-being. Like, I had no expectation for that. Boy, I sure would have liked that, but I did not expect it. And I'm sure you had the same experiences as I did. So I think that also those things are changing, which I think will allow maybe temporarily for a slight female gender advantage. That's what all the papers say that try to create controversy, right? A gender advantage for women in leadership. Because even though there's very little actual difference in their behavior, people expect them to care more. So they might rate them more positively or perceive them more positively. I think you're going to take care of me. My students certainly think I'm going to be more sensitive to their needs as a female professor. But again, to my point on development, these are all things that people can learn, right? You just lay out the expectation, or even better, have policies and practices. It shouldn't be up to any one supervisor to decide if employees have well-being and balance and autonomy. Maybe that's like a good org policy.
Yeah. As you were talking and kind of conveying the maternal nature of women, in the sense of being more caring and supportive and those things that men historically have not been credited with as much. I wonder if it's a double-edged sword from the expectation standpoint, because we have a female, and if people say, well, she's going to be more caring and more thoughtful and more encouraging and more all these things, and if she's not, it goes back to what you were saying earlier, people's expectations of a male professor versus a female, even though they're the same person in reality. I wonder if that isn't really a standard, that a subconscious standard that people have, that then can have negative impacts, even though this female leader may be extraordinary in a lot of ways. It can actually be detrimental.
No, that's right. And so one of my early studies, probably my most famous, widely cited study, it's called The Strong Sensitive Type, leadership, blah, 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 found exactly that. Like, we have these prototypes for leaders. They have been identified and replicated. They're pretty standard. So we think leaders are intelligent, they're dedicated, they're masculine. That's one of them. They're strong. And then they're sensitive is another one. And so I looked at those two expectations of strength and sensitivity and whether people expected them equally for male and female leaders. And they don't. They expect more for women leaders on the sensitivity, but they expect the strength equally. So to be seen as equally effective, and we did this in a number of ways with actual leaders, with paper leaders, when for a woman to be seen as effective as a man, and imagine like a vignette study, so we're holding everything constant.
Yeah.
They had to demonstrate both strength and sensitivity, because if they weren't sensitive, they're violating their female gender role expectations. And if they're not strong, they're violating the leader role expectation.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas male leaders really just needed to be strong in order to be effective. And we can all, I think, think of the anecdotes of great leaders that we've had, maybe in athletics, like coaches. They're not sensitive. They're like hard driving, but they're the best leader, the leader that helped you really be successful. And then try and think of a woman leader who was like that, who you really loved. And it just is a lot harder example for people to think of, because to some extent, we want women to be caring. And when they're not, we think they're, insert non-gender neutral slur here
Right.
because of that, because there's also the gender role expectation.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to know that I'm tracking.
You were right on. Yeah.
Tracking with
I'm
the
sure you
data
read the
there.
study. You just forgot.
Yeah. So I've read in a number of places that when studies are done in the controlled settings, laboratory settings, women typically do demonstrate a more democratic and interpersonally oriented leadership style. But then in bigger studies like real world, large corporations, military, and so forth, when they've looked at the same things, those differences aren't really present. I was just curious what your take is on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think you nailed it earlier when you talked about a selection bias for why we see, maybe more effective women leaders, because fewer are getting through. The same thing is true when you do a laboratory study of, it's like 200 college freshmen who may or may not identify as leaders, have any leader experience, have an identity, see themselves as a leader. So are there differences in the general population between men and women's behavior? Sure, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those will manifest themselves in laboratory studies when you select from the general population. When you're selecting from 1,500 managers in a large multinational corporation, your sample is very different than the 200 college students, because those are people who have elected to take on a leadership role. They've been successful in that role to end up, in that organization. And so you have a different, sample. And then there's like how I act in a 30 to 60 minute interaction might be more closely aligned to things like gender role expectations than how I really form long-term relationships with people over, if I'm working with a team, maybe I've been their supervisor for years. That's going to look really different. So I think that in small snippet settings, you're really looking at sort of what can happen, versus what does actually happen.
Yeah.
And I think that's why you get those. That's why the meta-analysis is good too, because you can examine whether that difference occurs in experiments versus field studies, correlational versus, manipulated.
Yeah. Well, I think that as you're talking, I was just thinking about my wife. She's a dentist, and when we were recruited to Stanford back in 2017, and she was going to be the director of the dental program at the Children's Hospital, and they didn't have a dental program. And so basically she built this dental program, and just exceptional leader, I mean, I study this stuff, right? So I can objectively, I am biased, clearly. I married her, but as objective as I can be, just phenomenal leader.
Yeah.
I would love to have a lot of her skills and capabilities. And this gets to what you were just saying, in that she is an introvert. She does not like, and she's not big on ruffling feathers and causing any sorts of problems like that. She's much better at the influence with relationships over time in real ways. But if you were to put her in a lab and evaluate her in a group of people, she would be the quiet one who wouldn't be taking charge. I would say she does not have command presence, in a real sense. And so, but when it comes to the rubber meeting the road,
Yeah.
I think she runs laps on me.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that's just,
that's a big difference. Wait, the context of what you're looking at.
yeah.
Especially for something like leadership, which we know is inherently relationship based. At least if we're talking about close leaders, meaning I'm your direct supervisor,
Sure.
not, presidential leadership, which, most people will never meet this individual in person.
Right.
Then all you have to go off of is their,
persona,
statements.
if you will.
Yeah, maybe hopefully their policies and behaviors, but in regular, I don't know, one-on-one leadership relationships, that relationship is really the heart of leadership. So yeah. I don't know how it's hard. I've done all the laboratory studies. I love the laboratory studies because they offer something else that you can't get in organization correlational studies, and that is the control. I can take everything, all the noise out, and say, I was just talking about the study I did in class. If you invoke stereotype threat, like tell women that women are worse leaders, which we know isn't true, but tell them that, and then make them lead a group. Do they perform better or worse? And we found they performed better, like they elevated their game, which is the opposite of what stereotype threat Claude Steele's research would show. So it was like stereotype reactance. You're going to threaten me. But if we put them into a demanding enough situation, so we tell them women are bad leaders, now go lead a group of all men, then they performed worse. They, got overly stressed out on the Yerkes-Dodson stress curve, and their performance declined. And you couldn't do that in an organization and, measure how stereotype threatened someone has and take that, look at the composition of their work group, because a lot of other information is going into that.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen several studies that looked exactly at what you're talking about. This idea that women lead women better, men lead men better, roughly speaking, when we're looking at these sorts of things. And it has to do, in a lot of cases, with this threat. And we see that with other things, right? Like minorities or women being told, you're not as good at math. And sometimes all it takes is like, maybe they put a picture on the wall or something, like something that just really that reminds people of this stuff, and suddenly their scores are worse. Like it's pretty profound stuff. So we have to pay attention to those kind of things, again, with our expectations of leaders and those that we're trying to lead.
Yeah.
Well, I was wondering, from your perspective, why are the things that we're talking about, these things discussing today, why are they really important for folks?
Oh, it's a great question. So I think it's important for women for the reason that we just talked about. So we get a lot of messages as women that women are worse leaders, right? That's not at all true. And you could say they're equal. You could say there's a slight female gender advantage because fewer women make it to the top. But I think debunking that myth so women don't experience stereotype threat when entering a leadership role is hugely important to closing the gender leadership gap. Because why? Because it's nice and I love women. Yes, that's true. And there's a huge talent shortage right now for leadership. We do not
Absolutely.
have enough qualified people to fill leadership roles. And we see women, and this is actually true for men too, but it's a lot of young people shying away from engaging in leadership because they find it threatening. Of Sue Ashford's work on image threats. Like, I don't want to take on this role because I don't want to fail. I don't want to be different. I don't want to be the tall poppy,
Yeah.
whatever it might be. And knowing that, I feel like a couple of messages that we talked about, it can be learned and developed.
Yeah.
No one gender is inherently better or worse.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like, for me, I see this as a huge service to organizations to step up and engage in a leadership role. They need you. And so it's it's how you can best help your organization is by jumping into a leadership role.
Yeah. Those are great, demonstrating the value of this conversation. This is actually the part of the podcast where I usually kind of jump into the scientific data to support the particular leadership concept that we're discussing. But obviously that's what we've been doing the whole time up to this point. So I want to shift gears on you just a little bit and ask a different question in this. That is, what's the story for you as far as how you got interested in studying leadership?
I know it's a great it's a great story, I think. So I think I am a natural born leader, but that's a joke because I don't really necessarily believe in natural born leaders, but I always found myself being asked to take on leadership roles. For whatever reason, I'm super tall. I don't know, there's that correlation between height and leadership, but it just made me really curious about, as a high school student, what does make people more leader-like? Maybe it is the deep voice. Not that I have a deep voice, but whatever it is. And so it made me curious to study, to learn more about that. And so I went to an undergrad that really focused on leadership and leader development as part of their, motto. Leaders in the Making it was when I went to college, the motto of Claremont McKenna College. And then I had this phenomenal experience with great mentors who empowered me to do, research on leadership, but also be a leader in that at the Kravis Leadership Institute myself. And that was a really long time ago, but I've never really drifted too far away from that. I studied leadership. I did my undergrad college thesis on leadership. I did my master's and my dissertation on leadership. And then I've just continued studying it. And now really my biggest focus is creating that environment where people can be successful as leaders for our students. So at the start of our conversation, you mentioned I'm the director of the Center for Leadership at University of Colorado Boulder. And our motto is that leadership is within us all. Mm-hmm. And so we really work to provide opportunities for students all across campus to grow their leadership, increase their self-confidence, reimagine the definition of leadership, not as positional, but as a service that we're providing to create a better world. We say our vision is a world where leaders of character meet the needs of humanity. And that's what we try to develop every day. So that's, for me, the passion now is giving back and hopefully creating the same opportunities for students that I benefited from.
Yeah.
Tom, what made you love leadership?
Wowzer. Yeah, so that's a good question.
It's so easy to ask the questions, right?
But yeah, it is. Just sit back and absorb. Growing up, I was always sort of pegged as this guy's a leader type deal. And then in medical training and then in my fellowship, people were like, oh, you're going to be division chief of cardiology someday. You're going to be, and they put these expectations on me. And so I was trying to figure that out. Like, do I really want to do that? I was in the military for 12 years. And so I got a lot of training there and got a lot of experience with that. And then in 2018, I really started to say, okay, all these people keep saying I'm supposed to be a leader, and I'm going to take on this role. And I really try to differentiate, just like you did. There's a difference between a leadership role and being a leader, and they're not synonymous at all. But if people are seeing that, I need to try to explore that in a real sense.
Yeah.
And so I started reading. I read a lot, and so I started reading. All of my reading became leadership related. So that was in March of 2018 that I really flipped the switch to start doing that. And in the fall of 2019, I had read about 150 books on leadership, and I said, I got my hands around this topic, I think, but I'm probably missing something. And so I started looking around for a master's in leadership, and found that at the Citadel. I was able to do that remotely, and so I started that in January 2020, finished that in 22. During that time, I started doing leadership research. I've written a fair amount in the medical field with regard to congenital heart disease. I'm a pediatric cardiologist and writing on that sort of stuff, but then I started doing leadership stuff and exploring that scientifically. And during the master's, I got this crazy idea for a study where it'd be great to have the leadership perspectives of 4-star generals.
Oh, wow.
And so I actually decided I would do that. And I ended up interviewing 51 4-star generals, did a qualitative analysis of their perspectives on leadership, all their stories and so forth. And that's in a book that our listeners have heard me talk about intermittently, that I'm in the process of editing and hopefully will be coming out before too long, that really frames out the 4 major components to exceptional leadership. Those are the 4 C's of character, competence, caring, which a lot of people wouldn't expect from a military 4-star, and then communication. And so anyway, so that's been developing over the last several years, and it's just unfolded. And so then it's like, I've done something with regard to the study of the generals and admirals nobody else in history has done. Like, I've personally interviewed 51 4-star military officers on leadership and captured all that in a way that nobody else has done. That was an extraordinarily important developmental experience for me, and it precipitated. Now I've enrolled in a PhD program in leadership, and so that to sort of recapitulate that experience, I'm hoping that I will continue to grow and evolve as a leader and come up with other crazy ideas that I can pursue. But that's a bit of the story.
Yeah, it's a good story.
Yeah. So, well, Dr. Johnson, we've covered what the literature says about differences in leadership between men and women. We touched on why that's important. You talked about a couple of things there that, with regards to women and with regards to organizations, especially. Do you have any practical points for our listeners? What can they do to capitalize on this information or practices that they can incorporate?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that is really, for me, where Inclusify, the book that I wrote, it came out in 2020, comes in. Because that's, I did interviews similar to your interviews with generals. I did interviews with corporate CEOs of organizations like Gap Inc. and Starbucks and General Motors and Salesforce and all these really great leaders, and asked them about leadership and diversity and inclusion. And, even though I'm not going to say women are better leaders than men or men are better leaders than women, I am 100% confident that having men and women and non-binary individuals and people of all races and veterans and persons with disabilities, etc., work together creates better outcomes. Mm-hmm. Because we know that having different perspectives in the room is going to elevate the outcomes that you achieve. You're going to be more innovative. You're going to be more productive. You're more effective, even if sometimes it doesn't feel like it, because it's easier to work with people who are similar to you. Mm-hmm. The end product is better. So that's not a practical piece of advice. That's just like a fact. Okay. Mm-hmm. If that's a fact, if leaders lead in a way that allows all voices to be heard, regardless of difference in gender, if you lead in a way that tries to here's my cute microphone. Give a microphone to each person in the room so you get their input on decisions. You're going to get better outcomes. And so that's the inclusion part with the first, 20 seconds of that statement, or 2 minutes, I don't know how long I talked, was the diversity part. Mm-hmm. But regardless of gender, leading in a way that all voices are heard is going to maximize your impact and make you more effective. That's the practical thing. And I can tell you all the ways to do that practically, but that's the big piece of advice is like if we spend our lives at work, we're investing, we want to be successful, we want to be contribute, and leaders just have to, open the door to allow that to happen.
Yeah. So you said you could tell us all the ways. Can you give us three ways to inclusify in that regard?
Yeah, for sure. So, one huge thing, I mentioned the microphone, but passing a microphone. So ensuring at meetings, meetings were one thing that came up a lot in my qualitative work. People are doing their job. They do it well. And then they come together with this group of colleagues and peers, and they are not always heard. And so designing meetings in a way that there's two-way communication, like everyone can contribute, use the chat, or, let people chime in on the chat, or have each person go around the room to make a point, whatever it is. If someone's not being heard there, you're kind of wasting their time and the organization's time, which is money, having them there. If you just want to go talk, just send an email, type it up, send it out. But otherwise, you should be creating an opportunity for everyone to contribute. I think that is huge. You said 3 things. Okay. 2, post, COVID. I can't believe you did your master's degree during the pandemic. That's like next level impressive, in addition to being like a pediatric cardiologist. That's amazing. But since then, as we've started to work more remotely, and I love the flexibility, I think that's great. And there's a negative byproduct to that people aren't spending as much time forming human connection in those relationships. Yeah. I said leadership's about relationships. So if you have a hybrid or remote work environment, it doesn't mean that it's any less important to invest in those relationships and get to know people. Maybe have planned days where people come to the office and you spend time with them. You think like, oh, everyone's in the office, we have to work. Yeah, I actually do my work faster, but when I'm at home, no distractions. If you're coming together, why not create a little room for that belonging opportunity? Yeah. A third way to inclusify. So I've kind of touched on the uniqueness, hearing all voices, the belonging. Maybe a third thing right now that I think is important is having some deep reflective conversations about why inclusion is so important for yourself. Like you can talk about it with your partner or like maybe outside of the workplace, because there's a lot of backlash, anti-diversity and inclusion sentiment. And if you can't articulate for yourself why you think it's important to be inclusive, and if you are male or female, it doesn't matter. The people on your team can feel that you don't see, this as important. So being able to articulate it for yourself and share it out with others, I think is going to help you with your leadership.
Yeah. Well, those are great. I really appreciate that. The inclusion thing it's an interesting thing, because it seems to me that a lot of people that are so against it don't recognize that if the shoe were on the other foot, that it would be clear to them why it would make sense. So the sort of picture I think about is, imagine a CEO, and that CEO is, let's say, over Southwest Airlines. And there is somebody whose job it is to ensure that the wheels literally do not fall off of the aircraft. The CEO knows nothing about the wheels on there's no CEO at Southwest Airlines who has or ever will be been the maintenance person for the wheels on a 737. That's not going to happen. But if there's a recurrent problem with the wheels on the aircraft, then that person's voice, who knows the ground level reality of what's going on, it needs to be heard. And this gets to Deming's work, and Toyota's quality. Like the person at the front line right there putting the bolt in the seat, or the carburetor fuel injection now onto the engine, or the battery mounts, or whatever it is, they're the people who can speak to the problem with the most accurate, up-to-date data. Why wouldn't you take that into account? Why wouldn't you at least listen to it? It doesn't mean that everybody's voice is equal. Like I don't, if somebody were operating on my brain, I want the neurosurgeon making the decision. Yeah. I'm not worried about the guy who mops the floor commenting on my brain surgery, but it may be that guy mopping the floor could say, hey, we're having problems with mold in that OR, because I don't want mold growing in my brain.
No, you don't.
So maybe we need to go to a different OR. Those sorts of things can make all the difference in the world for people's lives. And so it's not, in my mind, I don't know why, if you don't have a bucket of real-time ground level data, people wouldn't at least take advantage of that. Like that doesn't make any sense to me.
Absolutely.
So anyway, okay, well, I don't want to take up any more of your time. Dr. Johnson, it's been a pleasure to get to speak with you today. Really interesting conversation. Thank you for sharing all your expertise with us, and thank you for being on the Science of Leadership.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me and engaging in this, maybe difficult but important conversation.
Yeah, it's been great.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.